Welcome to CMO Convo Video. In this series, we highlight some of the biggest takeaways from the CMO Convo podcast, the show where we examine marketing leadership with some of the best and brightest CMOs in the biz. This is part 2 of our Storymasters series featuring Gaston Tourn, CMO of Curio, where we examine the importance of storytelling and marketing and why you need to consider your audience's willing suspension of disbelief to keep them engaged.
This is a phrase coined by one of my favorite poets of all time, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, in Biographia Literaria, which sounds very, very high-minded and fancy because that's what Coleridge thought like. But basically, it's a term that I think that gets thrown around a lot without people fully understanding it. So let's work on what is the actual definition of willing suspension of disbelief.
I think, Will, I'm going to leave this one to you. I already explained the strategy, so it's always like a lot of pressure. So you're going to explain.
Pressure on me. So basically, it's around. I'd say it's probably to do with sort of the being able to notice small differences in a big way that don't fit the inherent logic of the story. An example of this would be an animal suddenly speaking that when the story hadn't established that animals could speak in the story. Like you've got all these human characters and suddenly a random cat pops up and out of nowhere and starts talking to the characters. If you haven't established any reason behind why that cat can talk, it can pull people out of the story. If you've established that animals can talk right from the beginning, an example of that would be, say, Fantastic Mr. Fox by Roald Dahl. It establishes right at the beginning that animals have this society, they speak to each other, they act pretty similar to humans. If they had normal foxes at the beginning that suddenly started acting like humans halfway through the story, you'd be pulled right out of it and you wouldn't understand what's going on. And how this can apply in sort of marketing terms, I think the best way to think about it is consistency within the brand, within the story that you're telling. Like if you don't have some kind of inherent logic to the brand, to the stories, the experience that the customer is having, they'll notice all these little details, all these little problems, and it's going to pull them out of their connection with the brand and the story that you're trying to tell. So that's my perception of it in a nutshell. Gaston, thoughts?
I think completely. What you're saying is basically, look, if something looks like too weird or too unreal, people are going to notice it and they're going to switch off and they're going to be like, what? This doesn't make any sense. So you want to make sure you're building a world in whatever communication you're building that seems real. Of course, it's not going to be real because it's a story, but it needs to seem real. And that doesn't mean that you cannot use some magical elements, but the magical elements or the fictional elements or science fiction or whatever weirdness that you apply to the story needs to be believable in the story. Just maybe one example that doesn't show this, just to make it very practical. I think a lot of what we call in marketing product placements do it in a really, really bad way. Suddenly you're watching for example, a recent one, the new film or the new series of Sex and the City that I didn't watch, but everyone was talking about the Peloton's product placement and how bad it was because suddenly I think it was Mr. Big. I don't know. I never watched the series, but I saw all the news about how suddenly Mr. Big was training and then suddenly died with a Peloton, right? And I think it's just one example. I don't want to talk negatively about Peloton because I think it helped a lot of people to go through the pandemic. But I think a lot of those product placements are just so unbelievable that people immediately are oh God, actually this was all a fictional story. I'm not really into the story anymore. I'm just actually now questioning was actually the whole series a way of making money out of these product placements rather than actually telling me a story that is very compelling. So I think product placements are a very bad example of what happens when you actually don't follow the suspension of disbelief principle. You can do a product placement in a really organic and natural way. And I think if you do that, you're going to be suspending that kind of feeling of disbelief. But I would say most of them get it wrong. The actual technical term of what happens when you break that suspension of disbelief, it's called Deus Ex Machina. And I'm sorry to bring all the complex terms, but Deus Ex Machina, which sounds really, really weird, it actually comes from originally in a lot of theatrical plays and a lot of stories. Whenever the the writer didn't know how to finish the story, basically suddenly like God, which is basically Deus, like in Latin, God came and like finished everything, right? Like, suddenly like it was such a like, complex situation that the only way the writer could get out of that mess was with like God coming and like, I don't know, killing everyone, right? And then everyone was like, that's weird. Like, what happened? Why suddenly God is now coming and like killing everyone? Like, that came out of nowhere, right?
Where was he earlier when all the mess was going on in the first place? Like, yeah.
It's like, yeah, I mean, like the Bible, I'm sure like has a lot of examples of Deus ex machina, right? Like, yeah, I feel like it's a pretty like simplistic story as well, like the Bible. But I think what is interesting is like definitely Deus ex machina has its roots on this principle, which I think is something that everyone who tells a story sometimes gets it wrong, right? And sometimes it's going to have to use like these like out of nowhere elements that make the audience question like, oh God, that was actually a story. Like that was actually not something that I can feel fully immersed into. And I think that this is important because you want your audience to be fully immersed into your story. You want them to be so connected, so into it. It's almost like the metaverse, right? Like, nobody gets really what is metaverse, but I feel like in the end, it's like that immersive element, right? It's like really being so immersed into this world that in a way, if something like happens, you're going to start questioning, like, was this even real? Like, imagine if you're like in the metaverse with like those kind of like meta glasses, and then suddenly there's like a technical glitch. You're like, oh God, all of that was suddenly not real. And I think like that's what you're trying to do to avoid when you tell a story. And I think like product placements in marketing are like just probably one of the examples that get it wrong, because it's usually like, someone is having fun and like maybe like they are like, on a discussion, and then suddenly it's like, but have you thought about like drinking beer X? And like, I'm like, that doesn't make any sense for the story. It's just like so out of nowhere that people are going to like start questioning the whole world that you're building in that story.
Yeah, for sure. And I think product placements and particularly sort of influencer endorsements are a great example of that. Like seeing multi-billionaires advertising cleaning products that they've never used in their entire lives, seeing very, very wealthy people talking about using their own like bought in the box hair dyeing techniques when they clearly have a huge team of stylists around it. It's those kinds of inconsistencies that people will pick up on. And I think people are waking up to more and more now that they're more exposed to sort of like the information around these people, like particularly with influencers. I'm not going to name any particular names in this case, but yeah, there's a lot of examples out there. But yeah, I think as well, like you can still have like twists and turns when it comes to the story that you want to tell. Like that's what keeps things interesting. But those twists have to be logical within the story. Like an example of this is quite a dark example, I suppose. But like, say you've got a character who's walking down the street and suddenly they get hit by a car. That makes sense within the logic of the world they live in, because we live in a world with cars and we know that cars exist and we know that people do get hit by cars. But if an alien suddenly swoops out of nowhere and zaps that person, and we haven't established that aliens exist at all, that is breaking the suspension of disbelief. It's bringing in logic from elsewhere that doesn't fit within the logic that you've established within the story and within the logic of the brand that you're trying to sell. So going back to sort of like the cleaning products example, you want people who actually seem like they would be using those products to be advertising those products. You don't want people who don't know how to use your product or have never even seen that product stepping up and saying, this is great, you should use it, when there's no evidence, there's no logical consistency to why they would be using that product in the first place.
Completely. Yes. And I feel like you're using a concept that marketeers love, which is consistency, right? I feel like we love to say brands need to be consistent. And I actually wrote an op-ed around consistency. I wrote it for Adweek because I got a bit bored of the word consistency. It was a time where like basically every single idea I wanted to present to my team or like, marketing leadership when I was working in corporate, it was always like, that's not consistent. And I was like, God, like everyone is using the word consistency to actually not do exciting work. And I think like it kind of like went into circles. Like for me, I think like it was like, I hate consistency. I don't think consistency is the way to go. But then actually I realized like, yes, consistency is super important. And as you said, it's very important, but not for the reasons that most marketeers believe consistency is important. I think a lot of people think that consistency means repetition. So you will get this in corporate, especially like if you work for a corporate brand, whenever you try to spice up a bit the language or like change a few things, you're going to be told like, no, that's not consistent. Like we always use the same words, like this has to be this. And then you're like, really? Like we're sounding a bit robotic, like we're always using the same exact words. So what I argue in that op-ed is like consistency doesn't mean repetition, but consistency is actually essential to marketing, but not to basically like avoid repetition. What consistency does, it builds a world where like the brand feels authentic. So I don't think you need to be consistent when it comes to the actual language you use. What you need to be consistent is with the values that your brand stands for. And I think that's quite different. Like, for example, if you're a brand like Bumble, that you stand for gender equality, you don't need to use always the same words to express gender equality, but definitely you need to be consistent with that value. And I think it's the way that actually we interact with other human beings. I think like marketing has a lot to do also with human psychology. And I think that consistency builds trust, but it's the same as in any human relationship. If you have a friend that is always repeating the same words all the time, you're going to think like, oh my God, my friend's a robot. Like it's not actually a human being. So that's the same with a brand. If the brand is using the same language all the time, you're going to feel like, oh my God, it's like such a corporate, like such a robot, which is actually something that we tend to say even about brands. Like they always use the same words. Whereas in a human relationship, what you expect when it comes to consistency is the person just being authentic and like actually holding the same values. If someone one day says X and then the next day says the opposite, you're not going to trust that person because you're like, where do they stand actually? Like, of course, like values can evolve over time. But if one day you say, I am all pro X, and then the next day you say, I'm against that, it makes you wonder, like, can I trust this person? And it's the same with brands. I think like consistency means making sure that you stand for some values and actually you stay consistent to those values. That's what we need to focus on.
Authenticity is a great way of talking about it, particularly in the day we live in, where lots of companies and lots of brands out there saying that they support certain values, certain things in the world, certain societal movements, and then their actual actions don't match up with that. An example for that would be oil companies that claim to be doing a lot of work for renewable energy when they're still not making any big steps towards that. Another example would be companies that cover their brand in lots of pride imagery during Pride Month and then donate money to anti-LGBTQA politicians. So yeah, that kind of authenticity, breaking that ruins the suspension of disbelief. Like you've believed initially that these brands stand for certain values and they're doing certain things. Once you find out they're not doing those things, they're not being authentic about these values they're presenting, you've broken that trust, you've broken that suspension of disbelief about what this person or this audience thinks about your brand.
Yeah. And maybe like using a positive example, like I think one of the best examples of brand consistency is recently Patagonia, right? Like really giving the company a way to help fight, climate change. That's an example for me of consistency. It's not repeating the same words. I don't even care about like what words like Patagonia uses like in every single ad. What I care about is that consistently they are staying true to the same values that they have defended from day one.
And it's definitely not repetition as well, because it's a completely unprecedented move by the founder of Patagonia. Like no billionaire has given away this much amount of their company before in this way before. So it's a completely new thing, but is consistent and authentic with the values that they've been presenting previously. So that doesn't break the suspension of disbelief. Maybe if the CEO of Shell decided to give away the entire company to save the planet, that would maybe break my suspension of disbelief in a good way, of course, because that'd be a really nice thing to see. But that's just not consistent to their actions and to what they've been doing as a company previously. Whereas what Patagonia has done is very consistent with what they've been doing. So that fits within sort of that logical reality that they've created around the brand.
Completely, yes. And I think hopefully we're going to see this also with all companies, but definitely, like, you know, if that happens, like, people would even say like, oh my god, that's just like fiction, it will never happen. So it tells you that
Exactly.
good fiction doesn't look like fiction. Like, good fiction makes you believe in the world so much that you don't even think it's fiction. You need to make sure that you build a world that is so real that people believe in it and get so immersed into it that they even start questioning, is this fiction or is this real? I think Black Mirror is another example that was amazing. I think Black Mirror, everyone went away of it and they were like traumatized for like the rest of like their existence, because it was like, oh, actually this is quite real. Like, this is not fiction. Like, what Black Mirror is showing is just like quite like something that, you know, it could be very, very, very true and very real, with like what's going on in the world now and with technology.
For sure. But that's not to say that you can't have sort of a logical reality in sort of high concept stuff like sci-fi and fantasy. You can tell those stories, so you can have that kind of storytelling be a part of your brand, so long as it's consistent. An example would be, say, in Star Wars, we've established that people can do certain things with the Force, they can do certain things like influence people's minds and stuff like that. As soon as a character starts breaking out a completely new power, the fans get up in uproar, they're very upset. And that's because it's broken their logical consistency. Even though it's a fictional thing, even though it's based on stuff that doesn't exist in our reality, it's breaking the logical consistency that's been established by the story. And it's the same with brands as well. Brands, at the end of the day, aren't a real physical thing you can touch. You have to buy into a brand in order to recognize it as something that's valuable. And you have to have that consistency. You have to have that logical reality behind the brand in order to keep that buy-in consistent throughout your entire relationship with a brand.
100%.
Excellent. So how are you applying these concepts in your own role as a CMO? Like, are there any good examples that we can pick apart?
I think particularly when I tell customer stories, I think some of our customers that appear here, they have such amazing stories. Sometimes I'm like, oh my God, it's even like unreal, like, you know, what they went through and like, you know, how they managed to achieve what they achieved. I think like in my storytelling, what I try to do is make sure like I don't put the tension too much on things that are like so like just like, you know, so unreal or like so difficult that would make the viewer think like, this is unbelievable, this is not really something that could happen. Just one recent example, like we had an amazing customer, he's called Steve. Fortunately, Steve, like, you know, he lived in South London and he had some difficult like personal moments, and like he became homeless at the age of 16. But then by that experience, he actually learned how to cook using YouTube. So he was not like enjoying, of course, like the food that he was getting in hostels. So he learned how to cook by watching YouTube videos. From there, he became the chef of some amazing restaurants. He even got to become the chef of a Michelin-starred restaurant on the coast of England. He became one of like the master chefs of like BBC Two, Chef Brigade. And then his dream was always to launch his own restaurant, but I think a lot of landlords were not giving that opportunity to him because of like lack of maybe economic resources. And Appear Here, because we are all about like giving economic opportunity and giving opportunities to people who we serve and who have great ideas. We helped him launch his restaurant, his first restaurant in South London, where you know he's from. That story in itself, it's a bit like almost unreal, right? Like when you like look at it and you're like, what? Like, how did he go from like here to here? It's just like, it's such an amazing story. And I mean, like Steve is such an amazing human being that it almost like makes it hard to believe that, you know, someone like really could go from nowhere to such an exciting place in life. And I think it's so inspiring, the story. But when I was telling the story, I was always trying to focus on the fact that he's a restaurateur. I've been like really making sure like he's a chef and he was always a chef. Of course, he went through some hardship in his life, but at the core of like what he enjoys and what he does has always been food. And I think that was really, really important to make sure like there was that suspension of disbelief, right? Because I think if you go for a journey that is just like too unreal and like these like, you know, say from like nowhere to like the opposite place, but there's nothing in that original place that actually can explain where the story is going, I think people will start questioning the reality of that story. So for me to tell that story, which is called Shark Bait and Swim, you can find it on YouTube as well if you search Appear Here, Shark Bait and Swim, or you can actually go to the restaurant as well. If you're in London, it's in Deptford. It's an amazing seafood restaurant. But I think like in that story, I have always been very conscious of making sure like the journey was real and it felt authentic to the character. Steve was always a chef. He went through some hardship that made him, unfortunately, become homeless. But at the heart of like what he loves has always been food.
Yeah, so it's not like he's just, I don't want to say just a homeless person, but this is how people could possibly perceive it. Like, he's not just a homeless person who turned around one day and said, I want to open a restaurant. There is this narrative behind his motivations to open the restaurant, this narrative behind how he got to this place, how he built himself up. So it's not just like he's turned around and become this amazing chef out of nowhere. Like, there is this kind of logical consistency to this path that he's taken, to the story that you're telling with him, with Appear Here.
Completely, yes. And I think it's really important that you build that connection, because I think as an audience, what you need to live with is thinking like, we can all be Steve. And I think like a great part of like the lack of empathy with people who go through like really hard moments has to do with like not feeling that empathy. And I feel like making sure that, you know, you build that early on. There's a really good example from a Google search campaign. It's actually around like Google Translate rather than Google search. And it tells the story of a guy who was in Iraq, and he left Iraq during the war to move to America. But he really struggled with like English as a language, and how he learned English was using Google Translate. But what I love about that story is that when he starts, it basically already builds that empathy by, you know, the character saying like, I am from Iraq, and whenever I say Iraq, people think about bombs and like war, and it makes me laugh, because actually my memories of Iraq are amazing. Like, I used to have endless summers in Iraq. I used to have the most amazing food, the best life ever. But suddenly all of that changed when the war started. And I think that's a really, really good resource in that story, because again, it makes you like relate to that character, and you're like, God, that actually can happen also in my country. Like, it's not just Iraq that we're so used to watching on the news, like it's a country at war. Any country suddenly can have an experience like the ones that, you know, people in Iraq unfortunately had to go through.
I think that's why it's important in any story to kind of show how you get to the destination, how you get to a certain place, like, and that's a big part of suspension of disbelief, and being able to see the logic of like the building blocks that have got to a certain place, that have built up to a certain place. So it feels a little bit that we're talking about two quite different concepts today that seem almost like antithetical to each other, but they're not, are they? You can have defamiliarization and this sort of logical consistency within the story at the same time, right?
I think both are super important. I think you need to defamiliarize, but make that defamiliarization look familiar. I think in the end, it's that movement of like making the unfamiliar familiar, or the familiar unfamiliar in a believable way, that makes the stories really compelling and actually makes you turn the page, makes you want to watch the next episode, because it is a bit unfamiliar, but at the same time, I can't believe.
Gaston, so you cut out for a little bit there. So can we go from the top of what you were saying there? I think we would start with, where were we? It was, yeah, you can have Ostraneni and defamiliarization in the same place. So if we start at the top there, because you cut out for a little bit there. So yeah.
Sure. So I think like both Ostraneni and suspension of disbelief are incredibly important. I think they're not opposite ways of telling a story. Actually, Ostraneni, what it does, it makes the unfamiliar look so familiar that you stop believing that, you know, oh, that can actually happen. It's not like something that is so strange that could never happen. But also when you make the familiar unfamiliar, you do it in a way that is believable, that people can actually feel like that could actually happen. Like, you know, the example from Black Mirror, right? So that movement between like familiar, unfamiliar, and making sure that, you know, what we're building is in the end the same movement that makes stories so compelling and actually makes us want to watch them, because I think in the end we all try to like hear these stories and we tell these stories because we want to learn something about our lives and how we are how we can actually deal with the complexity of the world. So if it's so far-fetched that actually it doesn't look like real, or like we don't feel like we can learn anything about it, we stop probably watching. So you want to make sure like there is something that people can relate to and it seems real.
Want to know more on what it takes to be the ultimate marketing leader? Make sure you like and subscribe to this channel for more insights straight from the biggest marketing minds around. Visit CMOalliance.com for even more resources to take your CMO career path to the next level.